Okay, it's 11 o'clock and we are going to get started again. We are very fortunate to have for the next hour Dr. Debra Pinals with us. And Dr. Pinals is going to introduce herself and then I think ask you to introduce yourselves. But I'll pass it off to you, Dr. Pinals, and thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. This is always like a highlight of my year. I guess I come now about once a year, but it's really exciting to see people who are interested in this topic because we just need so many people who can work with the population of people with neurodevelopmental disabilities. So I just feel so honored to be invited to speak and part of this. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So as Sharon said, I'm Dr. Deb Pinals, and I work for the University of Michigan, and I'm contracted with the state of Michigan to be the medical director for behavioral health and forensic programs. I'm a psychiatrist by background who also has specialized in addiction medicine and forensic psychiatry. And although I had a very early interest in treating patients with neurodevelopmental disabilities and did some clinical work when I did some research at the National Institute of Mental Health. And when I was there, I also on the side had a clinic where I was moonlighting with people with developmental disabilities. So I did have an early interest in the population. But ironically, a lot of my career started to evolve in my role as a forensic psychiatrist, where I saw where a lot of things broke down and people with complex behaviors ended up, unfortunately, in the criminal system or in the juvenile justice system. And I know that's not the most people, for sure. It's a narrow slice, but it certainly teaches you where things have gone awry and where we need to do better in terms of supporting people in positive ways. And also I've spent a lot of time working in emergency departments, which is another place where you see things really fall apart. And so that's a bit of my clinical background, my career, which I think is part of what I want to talk to you about today. And I tell you this only because I was young once. I had no idea where my career was going to go. I just sort of followed a blind path and took one position after another. But essentially, I did a lot of volunteering. I participated in committees. I got interested in how local policies get written. Then I started to take on administrative roles within my clinical settings, a lot of state hospital, a lot of community mental health center work. And over time, I started working at higher and higher levels in policy, and I spent 17 years in Massachusetts. And ultimately, I became an appointed government official for the state of Massachusetts as what was known as the Assistant Commissioner for Forensic Services for the Department of Mental Health, where I was in charge of all the police, jail, prison, reentry, and court work. And we had a lot of people, and then the complex case reviews. And we had a lot of people that overlapped in the DD system in Massachusetts. It was a separate system. And so I did a lot of work in that space, trying to help problem solve. And then here in Michigan, my role is as the medical director for behavioral health and forensic programs through the University of Michigan, which essentially means there's a mental health law in every state. There's mental health codes. Our mental health code, actually, I'm going to talk about that because it covers things for people with IDD. But there's a line that says there has to be a psychiatrist who advises the director on best practices. And essentially that's my role. So I'm advisory. I don't really direct anything. I advise, I influence internally. I advocate for best practices. And, so training is a lot of what I do, but also just helping look at policies, Medicaid policies, all sorts of things that might influence the care and delivery of services that people get. So that's my background. And that's why what I want to talk to you about. And I only tell you my background really to say, I didn't know anything about public policy. I didn't know that would be what I would end up doing. And I just guess you never know where you're going to be when you grow up, and just take the opportunities to do things that are interesting and recognize that you have the potential to advocate for really, improved care with your extra knowledge that you'll have through the LEND program. You have the opportunity to be internal advocates, external advocates, pushing legislation, and hopefully my talk will give you just a little bit of information to help you think about these issues. And so with that, let me stop and just go around. Maybe I'll have you guys, since you know each other, do kind of what they call popcorn style. I'll pick on somebody. I see Allison Pert is top left on my screen, and then I'll have you call to your next trainee, and we'll just have the trainees tell me just a little bit about your background.
Hi, my name is Allison. I'm a fourth year PhD student in school psychology at CMU. Angela.
My name is Angela Cater. I'm a BCBA and parent of a child with autism.
Who do you want to call on, Angela?
Oops, Ada.
Hi, I'm Ada. I'm a second year master's student of behavior analysis and psychology at Northern Michigan. And I am so excited for this talk. I work with the juvenile justice kids up in the Upper Peninsula, and a lot of them are also abuse, neglect, and severe developmental disabilities. And I plan on working in adult corrections. So I just wanted to say that I'm really, really excited for this talk. And Kat, pick on you.
I'm Kat Zemke. I am a second year ABA grad student at U of M Dearborn. I'm actually also really excited about this presentation because I have about 10 to 12 years experience working with like domestic violence and sexual assault survivors and at-risk homeless youth. So there's this inner passion that I've had from when I used to be. I will always be a social worker at heart. But it does pique an interest of me as I've moved to focus more with kids on the spectrum. Nicole.
Hey, I am Nicole. I am a pediatric resident at Western Michigan University in my second year here in Kalamazoo. And I am also super excited for this talk because we get a lot of trauma-related issues coming up in our peds patients, and we're seeing more and more mental health issues with COVID going on. Right now, about half of our pediatric floor, which is just a medical floor, is psych patients, and they're just sitting there waiting to be placed because we lack those resources in our medical unit. And I will pick on Crystal if she has not gone. I've kind of lost track.
I'm here, thanks. I'm Crystal. I'm a second year developmental behavioral pediatrics fellow at U of M. Had similar experiences to Nicole when I was doing my pediatric residency on the east side of Detroit. Adam.
My name is Adam Soul. I work as a support coordinator for Saginaw County Community Mental Health. I'm also my last semester at Michigan State in the MSW program. And I will pick Amy.
I'm Amy. I am a learning disability specialist and advocate and a parent of a child, well, not children anymore, but anyway, with disabilities. And I have done a lot of work with as far as like a lot of the stuff as far as the pipeline between the connection with learning disabilities and prisons. And so looking at, which parts are academic or unmet needs and which parts are mental health, et cetera. So I will pick Sarah.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I am a second year medical student at Wayne State University, and I'm potentially interested in specialties related to neurodevelopmental disabilities. So I'm really excited to explore and for this talk. Sorry, I popcorn to Callie.
Hi, I'm Callie. I am a second year master's student in speech language pathology program at Western Michigan University. And I'm hoping to focus on like the educational sector. And I will popcorn to Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a third year dental student at the University of Michigan. And when I finish up in about a year, I hope to start a residency at a hospital. And I popcorn to Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather. I'm a speech language pathologist and a faculty member at Northern Michigan University and a PhD student through Western Michigan University. So I've got a lot going on, but through Western, I did some work through
their resiliency centers. So I'm interested to see how that, your talk applies to what I've done through that center. So thank you. And I popcorn to Ashley. I don't think Ashley's gone yet.
I have not. My name is Ashley. I'm a fourth year audiology doctorate student, currently completing my residency before graduation. And I will popcorn to Kaylee.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I am a third year audiology student at Wayne State University. I'm hoping after I graduate, I'll either be in like the educational audiology aspect or a hospital setting. And I will popcorn to Madison.
Hi, I'm Madison. I'm an occupational therapy student at Western Michigan University, and I had a short fieldwork placement at the Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital here, and I worked with populations who were deemed unfit to stand trial or things like that, where we had a lot of mental health disorders that we were working on work skills to get them employed again. And I will popcorn to Amelia.
Allen. Okay, my name is Amelia Allen. I am a social worker and I'm a research assistant at my DDI. And I do more so macro social work, working on the policy side of supporting adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I will popcorn to Amelia Chapman.
Hi, I'm the other Amelia. I am a third year audiology student at Western Michigan University, about to begin my residency in Traverse City. So I will popcorn to, who's left? Is that it? My last one? All right.
I think you might be. Wow, what a great group. My God, the diversity, the experience, that's great. And I'm super excited that you're excited about this talk. I hope I don't disappoint. And I am, one of the challenges with Zoom, obviously, is that we're all little flat screen squares. But the other challenge is when I'm looking at a PowerPoint, I can't see all of you. So what I would say to you is, let's use this. I have a PowerPoint, but let's use this as a conversation. So if we digress, you'll get the slides. If we digress, I'm fine with that. I really want to meet your needs and have this be student-centered, but I have some things that I thought I could start us off with. So, all right. So what I am going to be talking about is serving persons with IDD and autism with behavioral health challenges, policy, and system considerations. And so I mean, listening to all of you, I was sitting there thinking, gosh, I could have gone in any number of directions. So again, jump in with your own free associations and we'll cover what we need to. And I can't monitor the chat either. So I'll have Mike help me with that too, or somebody, just if there's a chat going on.
Yeah, I'm monitoring it. I'll let you know.
Great, thanks. And just so you know, I have no conflicts of interest. I do consult, in addition to my Michigan work, I consult to different federal, state, and local governments, and also contracted agencies around expert witness and systems. I do a lot of systems consultation. Next slide. So I think you probably know this, but from a sort of policy perspective, it is important to realize that you are entering into a world where there is, where we could say, here are the requirements for training on IDD in general psychiatry and generally for other mental health professionals. And you would think that when Mike clicks next slide, there's going to be this whole bullet point list of requirements, but essentially there are no requirements for most specialties. And I think I want to bring that point home, because when we do see people with complex needs and behavioral health challenges, there's not a lot of people that really even know how to work with the population. And although in pediatrics, there's some requirements, in child psychiatry, there are some limited requirements. In general psychiatry, which is where most, like for an emergency department physician, a psychiatrist like me, you're mostly going to get, or inpatient psychiatrist, you're mostly going to get people who don't have experience with IDD. Many people have advocated that there should be some shift in that, but that's true for a lot of mental health professionals. and some of you, social work training and the like. It's just, it's a pretty common gap. And that's something that I think is creates some of the challenges for the people that we're serving. Next slide. So I got asked in 2017 to write a paper with some colleagues. One of them is the IDD psychiatrist specialist in Maryland, Lisa Hovermail, and then Dr. Donna Mosh, who is the commissioner of mental health in Rhode Island and has worked in systems work for her entire career, worked for Magellan and others. But and then Lisa Anaker, who was one of my former trainees in forensics. And we were asked by what's called the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors to write a paper that is free and available to you online. This paper has been since turned into 2 peer-reviewed papers that have been published, were recently published in Psychiatric Services. But essentially this NASHPD, the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, is the organization that serves all the state mental health commissioners, is usually what they call them. Sometimes they're called directors, who are in charge of mental health policy. And there was a growing interest in looking at cross populations. So people with IDD who find themselves in the mental health system. I will say similarly, there's an organization called NASDs that you might want to tap into, which is the National Association for Directors of Developmental Disability Services. So it's NAS, NASDs, triple DS is the acronym. And they have also begun to work collaboratively with the mental health commissioners around understanding complex populations with dual needs or multiple needs at once. So I just point this out to you as a reference. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings in the paper, but if you're interested in this, I'm not saying it's a good read because I wrote it. I'm saying it's a good read because it covers a topic that I think is vast. Next slide. So in terms of policy, it's important to realize that there have been many things that have driven the care and treatment for people with these conditions, and not only their care and treatment, but how things work in society that allows for more integration, less stigma. And so I'm not a lawyer, but law and the legal regulation of clinical practice really are critical to understand, because in these fields, the laws are what define people's entitlements for services. For example, they are what creates a safe pathway for equity. And on the one hand, you could argue, gosh, if we lived in a fully fair and free society, we wouldn't need laws to carve out this space. But the reality is we do, because there's such a long history of discrimination and the like. So it's important for you as individuals getting into this work to understand how the laws shape the rights of people with developmental disabilities. And I don't know if you've heard about these before, but I'm just going to run through a few highlighted ones. First was this Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, which prevented discrimination on the basis of disability for people who were receiving federal services or federally funded services. So it was narrowly tailored to only those getting certain types of services. There was also a law passed in 1980 called the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, or otherwise known as CRIPA. And this sets out authorization to the U.S. Attorney through the Department of Justice to investigate what's called conditions of confinement in certain institutions. And essentially, CRIPA has authority over a host of institutions like juvenile justice facilities, prisons, jails, mental health hospitals like Kalamazoo State Hospital. And somebody can file a complaint, or the DOJ can hear about issues like through a story in the media, or any number of ways that an issue can emerge that the Department of Justice would then send a team in to go and investigate and then potentially create findings. They can litigate, they can actually have the power of suing the state or creating a remedy prior to litigation that then requires this institution to kind of step up to the plate and adhere to the civil rights of institutionalized people. So for example, it can range from anything like the practices, the architectural design that is fraught. I mean, lots of different things that can come up in these DOJ investigations. There's also the Fair Housing Amendments Act in 1988, which prohibits discrimination of persons with disabilities, among others, for housing. And then, of course, I'm sure you've learned about this one, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which actually was the next iteration after Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And what made the Americans with Disabilities Act different? Well, many things did, but one of the things it did is it expanded the prohibitions against discrimination beyond those who were getting federal services, and essentially created this pathway that everybody would get protection from discrimination in a variety of domains, including employment, government services, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. So it really was a major watershed event when the ADA was passed, because it really expanded the rights of people with disabilities to be treated equitably and not be discriminated against in these different environments. And then finally, the last law, and there's many others, but the last law that I want to highlight in this section is the IDEA, which I'm assuming you've also learned about, but essentially that was passed in 2004, which requires public schools to make available free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive alternative to all eligible children with disabilities. And it requires public schools to develop IEPs for each child that is unique to his or her specific needs. So when you really look at this, we're still in the infancy of the issues related to rights. When I grew up and there were segregated classes, I was born and raised in an environment where these expectations were not the norm. And so I'm not that old. And so people that have grown up in the era where these rights have been established have a very different sense of what is expected, what is normal. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help people accommodate to these new laws, and things still continue to get litigated because we're still not there where we need to be. So Mike, can we just stop sharing the screen for just 1 minute so I can look at the class? And I just want to pause there and see if there's any questions, or did you guys already learn about these laws? I'm curious what your familiarity is with these.
I actually don't remember if I think we looked at them in Myland, but I know that for my work, I look at them all the time.
Thanks, Amy. What about others?
Advocating for my son, I was always looking up laws to protect his rights. So I'm pretty familiar with those.
Great. So, okay. So it seems like, and we can go back to the slides. I just wanted to get just a quick kind of dialogue. But once you're in the advocacy world, you realize that these laws are really going to shape how things work. And that's why I say, learning legislative processes and even helping shape local legislation. School psychology has a pretty big focus with, Yep. So some of you are going to have to deal with these. And it's interesting because if you're in a clinical specialty, you don't often think about like the fact that laws are going to matter. But if you're in a clinical specialty where you have to apply rules to how this clinical service is going to be delivered or whether somebody even gets the service, it is important to be aware of what these laws are. And I think they're super interesting. And again, super interesting that we even need them, but we do. Okay, next slide. So there's also, so I guess I should go back and I do this with my trainees. I say, remember, there's 3 branches of government. There's the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. The laws that I was just describing come from the legislative branch, but there is this other thing called the judicial branch, where there are cases that are brought before the court where somebody is essentially filing a complaint, litigation, a judge makes a decision, and some of those cases end up being what we call precedent setting, in the sense that that becomes the law of the land. A lot of those laws interpret statute, but some of them interpret the Constitution. And when things go up to the Supreme Court, it's looking at constitutional rights of people in the US. And so there's 2 cases that I want to point out, both US Supreme Court cases that are really relevant to the historical evolution of rights for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The first case, which is cited to this day, is a case called Youngberg versus Romeo, which was essentially about a young man who was in an institution for people with intellectual disabilities, the old ICFID facilities. And the question was, you know, he was being restrained. There was a litigation that he was being restrained unfairly. And essentially what Youngberg versus Romeo, to make a long story short, what Youngberg versus Romeo established was that there is the freedom from restraint that is an expected right, that people have a right to be free from restraint. However, in these kinds of institutions, it is left up to professional judgment to determine when restraint is necessary under the least restrictive alternative. And I know, you know, restraint is like a messy topic. People don't like to think about restraint, but in reality, we have not come up with a full array of services that eliminate the potential of somebody being restrained in certain circumstances. The importance of this case, though, is that it really sets forth that the fundamental right is to be free from restraint. So that becomes really important language by the US Supreme Court, that people in these institutions have the right to be free from restraint. Because if it was turned on the other way, that institutions have the right to restrain, then you're talking about like a different denominator. So it's really important that the Supreme Court establishes the very principle that there's freedom from restraint. Doesn't mean there can't be restraint, and it means professionals have the right to decide when restraint is necessary, but it must be done as a least restrictive approach. And this really changes a lot of the landscape. This plus many other things changed the landscape from back in the day when people were institutionalized and restrained pretty often and without a lot of oversight. And so this is one of those things that, for example, CRIPA can help with when somebody is being, when there's an institution where there's an excessive use of restraints, this can be examined in light of Youngberg versus Romeo. Another case relates to this issue of civil commitment. And civil commitment is very common in the mental health world. I think that, I don't remember what the data was. I think there's like 25,000 petitions a year. I might be wrong, might be 50,000, but some thousands of petitions a year are filed with the probate court in Michigan for mental health commitments. And usually a mental health commitment is that if somebody is a risk of harm to themselves or others due to mental illness, then they can be involuntarily hospitalized, or what we have in Michigan now, involuntarily treated on what's called assisted outpatient treatment, which means there's a court order for outpatient care, which is, you know, from an advocacy perspective, it's an important thing to realize. It is a civil liberty deprivation because you have a court order ordering you to care, but it's done in the process of helping protect you from harming yourself or others. And it requires an effort at voluntary services first. So again, it's not like we rush to court order people into treatment. We have to offer people voluntary services first. But if they don't want voluntary services, and we think that due to their mental illness, they are a risk of harm to themselves or others, then the law allows us to involuntarily commit them. And in Michigan, we have a mental health law called the Mental Health Code that sets out the provisions for this. What Heller versus Doe did by the US Supreme Court in 1993 said that for people with IDD, that there was a state that had a different process for people with IDD versus people with mental illness, but still allowed for their civil commitment. And Heller versus Doe essentially said it is appropriate that you don't have to have a separate process, but it is fair to have a separate process. Actually, they carved out, and I'm not saying it exactly, they carved out that a separate process is constitutional for people with IDD. And actually in Michigan, we have 2 chapters of our mental health law. We have chapter 4, which sets out the provisions for civil commitment for people with mental illness. And then we have chapter 5, which sets out the provision for court-ordered treatment for people with IDD. It is very rarely utilized, extremely rarely utilized. It's called judicial admission, but we do have it in Michigan. So it is a separate and distinct process for mental illness. Now, when we talk about people who have both illnesses or both conditions, it gets super complicated. So if somebody comes to the emergency department with, let's say, intellectual disability disorder, and they have major depression, and they're suicidal and self-harming, and they don't want to come into the hospital, they could be civilly committed under the Mental Health Code under Chapter 4 for their depression and suicidal thinking. And so when we have co-occurring conditions, oftentimes the clinician on the ground has to sort out what's the primary issue and move towards treatment in a way that gets that person into care. So I'm just going to pause there because I've said a lot about case law. And these are all, like, any one of these topics is hugely, restraint and civil commitment. Like, I just go right to the jugular of complex issues. So let me just pause there and see if there's any questions or people who've had experience in these areas or cases that they've come across where they have questions. So if we could take the slides off, Mike, and pause for conversation.
I was gonna make a comment regarding the comorbid conditions. So I'm working on a project now that is helping to develop some assessment tools to measure mental health conditions in folks with intellectual disabilities, because right now the way that so tools aren't in plain language. They're not necessarily asking questions in a way that a person who has an intellectual disability can respond accurately. So that has been very helpful to me to figure out. And sometimes I do interviews with families, and a person will, score for, not necessarily for depression, because that's not what we're screening for, but we'll have a lot of, we'll meet a lot of the measures in the sad or grumpy, like that's how they describe it. So it's in plain language. And the person who's their support person, it could be their parent or their staff, never recognize that in them at all. But they themselves were able to identify that they've been having these emotions, but because they weren't expressed in a way that was at their level, it was missed a lot. So when you think about people with intellectual disabilities have been more overrepresented in the criminal justice system, I realize that there are a lot of people who may also have some other disabling conditions that are contributing to them being there that aren't being recognized.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Amelia. And, there are diagnostic, like there's the DMID, which is a diagnostic manual that takes the DSM-5 and converts it for people with intellectual disability and gives you some examples of where symptoms might not match up. But I think you're absolutely right. The typical way we assess people often misses things that might be going on from a mental health perspective. So I think that's super cool that you're working on a screening tool like that. Any other thoughts about anything I've said so far?
Yeah, I had something about the restraints, because I've been writing treatment plans for probably about 10 years now. And I see the focus now is that there has been a lot of restrictive language that has been in the plans previously. So like you talked about restraints, and then even like if someone says like in the plan, like if they have a behavior, the AFC home will give them a medication that can be considered a chemical restraint. So that something like that has been overlooked for a long time too. So we're trying to focus on the root cause of the behavior and not just, like I said, they're acting up. Well, why they act up instead of just giving them this medication that makes them kind of zonked out, because that's a chemical restraint. So there's actually been, I'm glad that it makes it a little more, because actually we're having to go through and review far more plans because there has been a lot of restrictive language getting passed through the plans, but I think more focus needs to be on all types of stuff like that to advocate for people's rights, because otherwise, if they don't have those people combing through the plans, then their rights are being restricted.
Yeah, and Adam, I'm going to talk when I get towards another part of my slide. There's a lot of reasons why things are being looked at right now. Again, these policies are evolving. So remember that case was 1982. A lot has evolved since then. CMS has taken on some of these issues with the home. We're going to talk about home and community-based services rules, and really are pushing integration in a major way and least restrictive alternatives and things like that, which, you know, it's an art to write a plan. You know, and it's always a balancing test, because you have to make sure, and I do these other talks for the Office of Recipient Rights, you know, where we talk about you have to not neglect people in order to preserve their rights. In other words, you can't leave people to run into the street and hurt themselves in traffic, or cut themselves to the point that they die. And that is one of the tensions that you always have to be balancing in those behavioral plans, is like, you don't want to leave somebody neglect is a different form of abuse. And so we have to be careful to not be overly coercive, to do everything we can to be person-centered, but to also recognize that sometimes it is going to be important to do those interventions, and when is it appropriate, and how do you train staff, and how do you do engagement first. And so the policies are trying to push the envelope around saying, like, no, you know, like everything possible before you get to coercion, but not to the point that somebody's going to be in harm's way. And with mental illness, we have a lot of these issues. You know, we have a guy, I've been tracking him. I actually tracked him with my DDI for a while at the state hospital. He's got both schizophrenia and intellectual disability, and he's got real bad paranoia. And when he gets paranoid, he gets aggressive and he kicks people, and he's really big, and can be really scary when he's really paranoid. But the problem is, if he doesn't get his medicine, he's more paranoid. But if he doesn't want his medicine, sometimes it requires a restraint to get him his medicine. And so we've had this tension over the course of the years that I've been following him, where, and then he also, I think he recently had a medical condition that needed a medical intervention. But because he was so paranoid, but the staff haven't wanted to put hands on him to get him the support that he needs, because they want to not be using restraint. But then you get into the situation of a guy who's not getting his medical needs taken care of, and his psychiatric needs go unchecked too. And so he lives in like the corner of a hospital ward, almost ignored. That's not what you want either. So I guess I point that case out because to me, it's a glaring example of the tension between restraint and neglect, and how do we balance that to give people the best care. And it's a lot of ethics, ethical self-checks, ethical rounds, collegial consultation to make sure that you've got checks and balances in how you're approaching care. Really important issues.
I have a question. It's a little separate from the case laws that you mentioned, but you mentioned the DMID, and this is the very first time I've ever heard of this resource ever. And I'm wondering, does this also include diagnostic criteria for children with mental illness and diagnosing children with mental illnesses when they have a comorbid intellectual disability? I mean,
You
we've
know,
seen a lot.
I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think it goes through all the diagnoses, including those in childhood, and
Okay.
converts them. And, you know, it's not a well-known resource. I didn't know about it until I got into this field and started learning more and more about this. It's you know, it's not recognized by insurers, you know, you know, those criteria, but you can use it. You know, in other words, a lot of times you'll say you have to have the DSM diagnosis, not the DM. But I think you can use it to justify why you're coding someone a certain way and what billable service you're doing. It helps you translate the symptoms. Like, what does mania look like? Like Amelia said, what does depression look like? And so I think it's a useful guide as you're doing your clinical assessments and looking at your data to try and understand what might be going on for someone. But it's not recognized like the ICD is, or like DSM-5 is. I look at it as a support tool.
Okay, thank you.
So I definitely would recommend that you get it and look at it.
Where would you be able to get it exactly? Would you just?
The paper, and I can give this to Mike. I mean, the paper that I showed you that we wrote is a gray literature paper. It's available for free online. You can also look in the psych services, and then we source that's a citation in there. I think if you just Google it, you can buy it from NADD. It's the National Association of Dual Diagnosis. I think that's who sells it. Thank you. Allison already gave you the link. Okay, we'll go back to the slides. We can go to the next slide. So that goes to our DSM-5. You know, DSM-5 actually literally this week, I believe, came out with its text revision. And I'll be curious to hear what Sharon and others think about any of the text changes around intellectual and developmental disabilities. But the DSM-5 is a diagnostic manual that gives people helps code for insurance and helps with diagnostic clarity, and has been working towards modernization. You know, it's moved from the old terminology, which I know can be really upsetting, but the old terminology of mental retardation to the terminology of intellectual disability disorder. Really has moved from looking at just IQ as a way to diagnose to including and emphasizing adaptive functioning as a much more significant measure. And these diagnoses, one could argue, are just labels and line drawing and all that. And they are, and where case law is really, I mean, they really are important, and not to get into some very politically sensitive issues, but the diagnosis can be a matter of life and death, because we have case law in America that looks at even death penalty qualifications, that if somebody, you know, where the death penalty is, you're not allowed to administer the death penalty for somebody with an intellectual disability. And so that diagnosis can actually be a matter of life and death. There's all sorts of other case law that looks at standard error of measurement and the importance of adaptive functioning, but these things can be super important, from basic insurance to really complex legal situations. Next slide. In the DSM, the neurodevelopmental disorders have been put into one chapter, looking at communication disorders, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, specific learning disorders, motor disorders. I think you guys would know all this, as well as the intellectual disabilities. Next slide. Then we also have definitions. So part of what I want you to understand is that where definitions come from can make a difference for the people that you're serving. We also have a definition in our mental health code. Section 1100B defines intellectual disability legally as a condition manifesting before the age of 18 that is characterized by significantly sub-average intellectual functioning and related limitations in 2 or more adaptive skills, and that is diagnosed based on the following assumptions: that there was a valid assessment with cultural and linguistic diversity, and takes into account differences in communication. Existence of limitation in adaptive skills occurs within the context of community environments typical of the individual's ages, peers, and is indexed to the individual's particular needs for support. Specific adaptive skill limitations often coexist with strengths in other adaptive skills and other personal capabilities, and with appropriate supports over a sustained period, the life functioning of the individual with an intellectual disability will generally improve. So this is literally codified in law. And if you have an intellectual disability, it can qualify you for certain services. Next slide. And the settings where people are served can be hospitals as well as communities. Next slide. So in the old days, there used to be in Michigan ICFIDs, intermediate care facilities for people with intellectual disability disorder. These do exist in other states still, although they've been massively downsized in the last few decades. In Michigan, the last one to close was the Mount Pleasant ICFID. We can go to the next slide. When Mount Pleasant Regional Center for Developmental Disabilities closed after being established in 1893 and closed in 2008, there was a very intensive closure plan for what to do with these people that were housed in this facility. And most of them were able to be discharged to community-based settings. A few of them were not able to be discharged to community-based settings. And in fact, one of the ways that I got connected to my DDI was because my DDI was assigned to monitor the progress of individuals who didn't make it into the community, but instead got transferred largely to Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital. And my DDI was assigned to provide oversight of their care and well-being and get them connected to community services. And I came to Michigan in 2016, and there were still people from the old Mount Pleasant closure that were hospitalized at KPH, and I think still are to this day. Next slide. And so what's interesting, this is a picture of KPH, one of you worked there, Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital. When the individuals were moved into the state hospital in Michigan, the state hospitals in the old days of state hospitals, they did have people before ICFs bifurcated off. The old state hospitals basically were catch-alls. They had people who today are in nursing homes. They had people with schizophrenia and serious mental illness. They had people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They even had people with, let's say, Huntington's chorea, a neurological condition, people with neurosyphilis that's now treated basically with antibiotics, and we rarely see cases of neurosyphilis. So they had all sorts of people that came into the old state hospitals. Little by little, from a policy perspective, populations were being given more specialized attention. So that's how nursing homes started to get developed for people with dementias, mostly people with dementias, or people with traumatic brain injuries went to other places like neuro rehab facilities. Again, people with IDD went to ICF facilities. And so the population of people within the state hospitals, actually we had people with epilepsy that were hospitalized in the Caro Hospital with, refractory epilepsy. Medications helped with that. And so people more and more were able to be integrated into community-based settings, or if they needed a more intensive setting, they went to other settings that were more specialized for their needs, which left the state hospitals responsible for people with serious and persistent mental illness, which then meant that the care and treatment and services were designed to treat people with serious mental illness. So when Mount Pleasant closed and people with IDD were transferred to Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital, it did not come with commensurate training and positive behavioral support planning and all the things that we know are necessary. Now there are units that are building. We have ABA units that are starting to be built up in these facilities. But we do have these complex populations of people with IDD, serious mental illness, some of them involved in the justice system. I heard one of you say when you worked there that you worked with people that were found incompetent to stand trial. And so we do have a growing amount of services that recognize this population. But again, from a policy systems perspective, all of this is iterative. You know, there were decisions made that and laws that were passed that sort of separated out these populations, built in more specialization, and yet you still have some of them coming into places where they may not get the best services because people aren't as skilled at those services. And so now we need to build up those services to help individuals. Sharon, feel free to jump in if you have anything you want to add from your work with My DDI.
You know, I was just going to say, and thank you. You know, I was just going to mention that this afternoon, Angela Martin from My DDI will be continuing with Mark McWilliams this conversation. So there may be some overlap in what Angela shares, but Angela brings considerable expertise. So
oh, perfect. Yeah. So that's you know, gives you like a historical perspective. And by the way, if I could just give you a book that you might be interested in, it's called Annie's Ghosts. I don't know if people have read Annie's Ghosts, but I think it's now out of print, but you can get it on Amazon. A fascinating account of a young woman with intellectual disability and maybe mental illness. I think her diagnosis was a little bit unclear, that sort of got hidden away in an institution in Michigan, gets discovered by her nephew, learns at his mother's deathbed, learns that her mother had a sister and that she was institutionalized. And I think what's fascinating about it is learning about the history of the institutions in Michigan and this complexity of the stigma of somebody with an intellectual disability who gets kind of hidden away. No one in the family talks about her. And yet she lived her whole life in institutions. It's a very well-written book, and it's fascinating to if you're interested. So next slide. Okay, so then again, as I said, in the mental health code, we have judicial admission, which allows for the commitment of people with intellectual disability through a court order. And again, this is based on if the person has harm to self or harm to others as a risk factor, or that they've been arrested and charged with an offense that was a result of their intellectual disability. So most people that we have in the state hospital that are ordered under Chapter 5 of the mental health code are ordered through the courts after some arrest. Sometimes they're found not guilty by reason of insanity, which people with intellectual developmental disability can qualify for, and then they get court ordered into care. Next slide. And again, we have people, thanks, Sharon. We have people that are found incompetent to stand trial. And then, you know, you have some people who make it through the trial process who are found guilty and may end up in jails and prisons. So we do have there are a disproportionate, not just in Michigan, but around the country, there is a disproportionate population that ends up in the correctional system. Next slide. And often it's because, you know, their behaviors are assaultive, sometimes sexual in nature because of some of the challenges in navigating the nuances of social relationships. And so some would say the ARC uses this data that 4 to 10% of individuals in corrections have some form of IDD. And some of this may not have been recognized in childhood. There's a whole bunch of literature emerging about fetal alcohol syndrome and the high prevalence rates of fetal alcohol syndrome in prison and jail populations. But there is no universal screening. So when somebody comes into a typical jail or a prison, there's not going to be a screening for whether they have IDD. And so that puts them at risk potentially for victimization. Sometimes it's obvious. And for example, the DOC has a unit for that they have identified in Ionia, where they have their IDD unit with some specialized programs. Because if you have somebody that's super vulnerable, you worry about victimization in those environments, but you're going to have people that aren't going to be recognized as well. Next slide. There's also these community provisions. We'll go to the next slide, Mike. Again, where we have people with behaviors, you can have behaviors that are masked or interpreted as mental illness that go into the psychiatric units when the issue is really, maybe somebody, I heard a case not too long ago of somebody who had been living with their parents. Their aging parents couldn't manage them anymore. So they got sent to an AFC home. This person was unfortunately abused in the AFC home, became reactive, aggressive, moved to another AFC home, was reactive, aggressive, probably had post-traumatic stress disorder. That AFC home sent the person to the emergency department where they were, again, reactive, aggressive, and ended up in restraints in the emergency department, and people were looking for psychiatric hospitalization. And, you can make the argument that yes, they're reactive and aggressive, and yes, they may have PTSD, but is psychiatric hospitalization the right place for them? Or do they just need a better supportive environment with more stability where they're not going to be abused? And so, could there be a less restrictive placement? When they go on to the psychiatric unit, sometimes those staff aren't as well equipped to deal with the population. Some states have specialized units. We do have some units in Michigan that have a certificate of need that they can handle people with IDD. But oftentimes if they can't, then some of those aggressive behaviors, aren't well attended to, and you can have all sorts of issues that come up on the units, which is why we need people who understand these populations to help consult. And so I'm not infrequently consulting on some of these issues to try and help sort out best practices. Next slide. The people with IDD and behavioral health issues are going to be at increased risk for what we call ED boarding, where they're waiting for placement, especially for children. And so obviously trauma-informed care, person-centered care, understanding self-determination and decision-making supports, and seclusion restraint prevention is something that we have to continually teach and push for from a policy perspective. Next slide.
Dr. Pinals, just want to let you know you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. We can go to the next slide. So what more can we do? Let me just go through some other comments and then I'll end because I know we're going to run out of time. I knew I was going to run out of time before I finish my slides. Next slide. There are some really major advocacy efforts going on. There's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's an international movement that really is trying to push for the ongoing rights, non-discrimination, full inclusion, equal opportunities. Next slide. And then we have treatment and support systems that might be needed to help support individuals along a multidisciplinary perspective, which you guys, of course, should know, both habilitative services, behavioral supports, pharmacological supports when necessary, environmental supports, and then financial supports that can help wrap services around people to give them the treatment that they need so that they can be living and functioning fully integrated in community-based settings. Next slide. We have done a lot in Michigan to look at autism spectrum disorder. This is really just sort of some things that have happened. We've built up evaluator credentials, supervision, professional development, helping with diagnostic evaluations. There was a lot of policy work done around autism in Michigan. And we went from one of the states that was kind of on at the bottom of the barrel in terms of having people with as BCBAs and the like, to being one of the states that's in the top 10. And that took a lot of policy work. We had a lieutenant governor who had a child with autism spectrum disorder, and there's nothing like a politician who cares deeply about the subject to make sure that during their term they get important bills passed. And I think that was an example with Lieutenant Governor Cali. Next slide. That's the example of our staffing going up, which is pretty cool to see. Next slide. We have, again, organizations that support these approaches. So you have that reference. We can go to the next slide. I'll just buzz through some of these just so you kind of get a sense, but you'll be able to look at them. I kind of talked a little bit about these cases, so we can skip this one. Next slide. COVID has been a huge issue from a policy perspective. Next slide. We've seen disproportionate impact of COVID on disability populations. So we have to understand that a little bit more. Why is that? What could be done to prevent it? How do we meet their unique needs? Next slide. We had established this support program called Michigan.gov, the Stay Well program, and it's still active if you go to this link. We have targeted people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as a unique population to try and provide additional supports. We've had webinars, support groups, various things that we've done to try and target the unique emotional challenges that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have had related to the isolation of COVID-19. And there's been a lot of work with our DD Council and others to build supports during the pandemic. Next slide. So a lot of things to think about. Trauma is a major risk modifier when we see people with these complex populations. Next slide. The ACEs, I think you're familiar with. I'm sorry to buzz through these, but I'm just going to buzz through them. Normally I would skip to the one I want, but go ahead, Mike, just buzz through these. We've talked about the criminal justice, looking at trauma in a way of thinking about universal precautions, like we wash hands now, we don't think twice about washing hands, really looking at the population when you see people with the complex issues of mental health and intellectual developmental disability. It is such high prevalence of risk of abuse and neglect that we really want to assume that that may be part of people's story and really work hard to treat them with, separate from abuse and trauma. We want to treat people with dignity and respect anyway, but understanding that we need these trauma-informed approaches ubiquitously is going to be really important for driving improved practices over time. Next slide. Let me see what I can end on. And again, just the policies around minimizing coercion and maximizing choice. And I really tried to emphasize laws related to that and know that our policies and laws really require that, as well as the practices. So I think because I'm going to run out of time, I'm going to leave the slides with you. Let me just see if there's any comments or questions about, other things that were on your mind as I know I'm over, so I want to be sensitive to your need for a break as well.
Just like going all the way back to the idea of just the definition of intellectual developmental disability. The kids that I work with, some of them meet very specific criteria of recognized developmental disabilities, fetal alcohol syndrome, ADHD, autism, but some of them don't. But then you look at their life history from literally birth until 15, 16 years of age, and they have been so traumatized to the point that I can't even say what has happened to them. It's atrocious. And they are at this point in their life where they're being viewed as criminal or dangerous. They're very assaultive. They have this view of the world that is very reflexive of their experience, and it's horrific. And the path that they're on at this point is towards adult prison, unfortunately. And they're currently in a group home situation. But my fear is that the second they turn 18 and, they assault a police officer, as many of them are very prone to doing, they're not going to be seen as they're not going to be seen as having a disability. They're not going to be seen as any of those things. But that definition is so ambiguous. It's like anything that presents before the age of 18. And I mean, we're all developing throughout our lives. How could we make the argument that these kids are severely disabled based on their experience?
Yeah, well, that's a super interesting question. And so the reason why I show you the laws is because laws are only written in black and white. They're just words on a page, but humans are much more complex than the laws. And so, some people, how those laws get interpreted and put in practice can make or break how somebody's experience is in terms of what services they might be eligible for. The other thing is, I didn't talk about this, but Michigan is in the process of being sued for its children's services for Medicaid eligible youth with serious emotional disturbances. And so there's a lot. We just had a major transformation organizationally to try and put more attention on children's needs. and this is happening around the country. We're not alone. We're just in the wave of litigation, but that's a wave of system transformation that's happening too, where the idea is to do better early screening to identify youth with needs, kids, little babies, with early needs, identify traumatizing environments, and route people into more supportive networks so that we can potentially prevent those downstream consequences. And just like I didn't grow up with these laws protecting, when I was young and in school, there was segregation of people in school. Now there's not. I can imagine a future because of this litigation that's happening around the country. In 20 years, things will look very differently because we've baked in a lot more prevention strategies. And I think that's great. We're also doing a lot. I didn't even talk about the child welfare issues and substance use and laws. We know, for example, substance use disorder is one of the major factors in child removal. And, fetal alcohol syndrome is one of the major factors in creating neurodevelopmental disabilities. So there are a lot of laws now being put in place around, don't just remove the child, give the family a safe plan of care, treat the mother and father or whoever is in the household if they have an addiction, help that baby be living in a nurturing environment and not be in an abusive environment. We have baby courts, family drug courts, all sorts of ways that now we're looking at getting upstream to those problems. So I guess, you're bringing up a really good point. These laws are definitions and placeholders, but I think we're seeing a very evolving landscape in the policy framework, which is why, even though I just gave you like this little narrow sliver of things to think about, this field is vast. There is such a need for advocates. There is such a need for people to pay attention to the laws that are coming out and to the services. And whether you're just advocating for the person you're treating or advocating for the system around you or advocating for your child, each person's role is so important to keep pushing the envelope so that people get better care.
I want to just give a huge thank you to Dr. Pinals. I think this is really going to set the stage. And you even said at the beginning, like each law, each piece could be its own day-long session. So it's hard, and you were given a Herculean task to cover it in an hour. But I think you did such a wonderful job teeing us up where we can continue the conversation this afternoon. Mark McWilliams, who is an attorney, will be co-presenting with Angela Martin. They bring a lot of expertise. And if you're over the lunch hour, you're having thoughts or questions, we can continue this conversation in the afternoon. They're going to be focusing in on some of the nuts and bolts on how to do advocacy, but having this background and knowing how vast it is and how you might tap that in strategic ways, be thinking about your questions over the lunch hour, which is now. It's a little shorter than a lunch hour, but it's, I think, a 53-minute break. So any burning questions or things that we need to touch on before we break? We're going to start right at 1 o'clock. So if you come on, turn your cameras off and then come back maybe a minute before 1. We'll start promptly at 1. If you get a chance, go get some fresh air, get a bite to eat, stretch, whatever you need to do. I strongly encourage you to step away from your computers if you
and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great break, everyone, and we'll see you at 1.